Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm your host, the OT Astartes, and welcome back to another edition of Astarties Analysis. Now, before I begin, I would like to say that I'm now having a sort of different format where I'm basically recording all my audio on a little app called Audacity. Now, I will edit what I'm saying so it makes more sense. So, at the end of every sentence I might be going, like I'm Homer Simpson. So now we begin to talk about Hetty Feather Season 4. So, the end of the last few episodes, we were introduced to Calendar Hall and its many characters. And Hetty, Sheila and Gideon are now integrating into their new lives as staff members to Rosamund and George Calendar. So we're beginning Series 4 with Episode 1. So, Hetty is now getting used to life at Calendar Hall. We get a montage of Hetty fulfilling her new duties, and she goes to the scullery only to be ordered to get some firewood after she empties the chamber pot. Now, we're introduced to a new character as well called Mrs. Whittock, who's basically the southern version of Cook Jenkins. You what? You replace me with some southerner? Oh, this shan't stand. And she seems to think that she's more efficient than I am. Oh, well, guess what? You've never had to feed as many hungry mouths as I have. It's Jamie Oliver versus James Martin. But I don't mind Mrs. Whittock. But I like Cook Jenkins as well. Which one's better? There's only one way to find out. Fight! Does anyone remember that? Does anyone remember how great TV Burp was? So anywho, we also see a pregnant Rosamund being handed a note by George and walking away frustrated. Edwin is then being pushed by Emily and Constance is running away from the nursery maid. The staff then assemble as Rosamund shares the news that Mrs. Penhaligon has left Calendar Hall, so nobody will have any time off. So Hetty's intentions of seeing Ida are put on ice. Ah yes, so now that Mrs. Penhaligon's left, I bet they're all celebrating. I'm surprised they're not celebrating. A carriage then pulls up and Agnes is mortified at whatever's coming out. She seems to dread whoever could be exiting this carriage. And it is another new character called Lady Grenford, who is played by Scottish actress Georgie Stone, who is known for her role mostly now as Mrs. Higgins in Call the Midwife. We then get a new title sequence, which is a montage of the servants going about the house. After the title sequence, Lady Grenford makes her entrance, who has arrived early and is similar to Horrible Grandma, and has also brought somebody to replace Mrs. Penhaligon as housemaid. Emily and Constance hide from her as she walks upstairs, and the nickname that Emily gives her is Dragon Lady. Ah yes, I didn't know that Daenerys Targaryen had suddenly become rich and retired after she burnt down King's Landing. So, down in the scullery, Hetty is fixated on seeing Ida. Agnes tells her to forget about it and to get back to work, while Mrs. Whittock shuts down the entire conversation. In comes Brodie, the assistant of Lady Grenford, who is looking for tea and biscuits, and she presumes that Hetty will be serving them today, but she has an errand that she must run first, which Brodie allows, and says that someone else will see to it. Outside, Edwin is looking for garden specimens while being pushed along by Gideon. Jack is invited to join in, but he's too busy to do so. However, he changes his mind, and while he runs off to join Edwin and Gideon, they are being observed by Brodie, who then goes to collect the tea from Hetty. Hetty goes into the living room to set up the tea, and Lady Grenford comes and meets with Brodie. She praises Calendar Hall and goes to sit down for her tea, when she too observes Gideon, Jack and Edwin with great shock. While Edwin and co are on their expedition, Jack talks to Edwin about a remedy for sore throats and healing wounds, the knowledge of which was passed down from the old head gardener. Edwin describes Jack as a natural forager like himself and tells Gideon to tidy a path up. Edwin then reaches out for cow parsley, but he falls whilst doing so. Horrible Grandma, I mean Lady Grenford, is meeting with George, and she is bashing Rosamond while referencing her past, and then goes on to say that George needs to meet more people of influence. She recommends that he has lunch with Lady Wadsworth, and then asks Hetty to send for Emily and Constance. Back outside, Edwin is being checked over by Gideon and Jack for wounds. Edwin reports that he is fine, but Jack and Gideon bicker a bit. Emily's parade's about to get rained on because Hetty comes in fetching her, interrupting her research. Constance and Emily have a game of chase and run into the drawing room, and Rosamond comes in as well. Constance doesn't want to have a baby sister because she wants to protect her dolls. George, however, tries to reassure her that they might have a boy instead, to which Lady Grenford says that they'll have an heir. But George already has one, being Edwin. But Grenford believes that Edwin may not have the strength to represent the calendar name. Emily reacts to this and recites some poetry, but it does her no good. She tells Lady Grenford that she is studying in medicine, but she is detested once again and is told to focus on more domestic households. Of course, referencing Mrs. Penhaligon, which is aimed at Rosamond. Rosamond starts to stand up to Lady Grenford, but is interrupted when she talks about seeing Edwin being wheeled outside and then orders Hetty to go and get the teas. Edwin is returned to his room and he begs Gideon and Jack not to tell anybody about the fall. Brody comes in at that moment, ordering the gardeners to get out. Edwin seems to have some memory issues after the accident, but Jack and Gideon are both dismissed and Edwin is taken away. Hetty goes back to the scullery and she pleads to see Ida while talking about Lady Grenford belittling Rosamond, but she is told to work by Agnes. She goes to talk to Sheila and comments on Brody, and recalls that she did smile earlier, and presumes that she's trying to keep her on Lady Grenford's good side. Sheila, however, doesn't think so, and they banter for a minute, which Agnes shuts down as she hears the upstairs bell ringing. Mrs. Whittock chips in and advising everybody to not meddle in other people's business. Gideon runs into Hetty and feels as though he needs to tell everyone about what's happened to Edwin, but Hetty warns him not to do so as it would anger Lady Grenford. She offers to find out more and they both split up, avoiding Brody, who reports to the calendars that Edwin is dizzy and he has a fever. Emily diagnoses influenza and Grenford thinks that it is a contagious infection. Rosamond volunteers to check up on him, but for the sake of the baby, she is told to stay away. Lady Grenford orders Brody to escort Rosamond back to her room and send for a doctor, while ordering Emily to keep her company and to take Constance back to her room as well. Yeah, she's probably going to call for Dr. Turner. It could happen. Or we could probably get Trixie or Nurse Crane. It's probably going to be Nurse Crane. While being taken back to her room, Constance spots Hetty and is curious as to why she's sneaking around. She threatens to tell Dragon Lady, but Emily asks Hetty to keep her stepmother company. She's about to tell her about Gideon's fall, but Emily is in a rush. In fact, she's in so much of a rush, she appears to have teleported immediately to Edwin's side. So she tries to keep the fever down and spots spores on Edwin's hand and forearm. George and Grenford walk in at this moment just to add to the chaos. Now we cut to Rosamond, who is frustrated as to why she's confined into her room and wants to see Edwin. Hetty is about to tell her about the fall, but she goes on to say that with all that fresh air he must be strong. She then goes to fetch more tea and will keep Rosamond well informed. Back to the patient, and Dr. Emily believes that she can diagnose Edwin based upon her book. Well, it's more useful than self-diagnosing, I guess. Or consulting TikTok for that matter. The trio go outside and are told of Mrs. Calendar's concerns by Hetty. Everybody then theorises over Edwin having a very serious illness, from measles to a range of other diseases. George tells Hetty not to inform his wife, as she'll only worry. Lady Grenford leaves and Edwin coughs, prompting Emily and George to attend to him immediately. Returning to the scullery, Hetty returns and is cheekily spoken to by Sheila. Hetty has gone down to get Rosamond's tea and she's still whittling on about Ida, but Mrs. Whittock says that she'll understand if she is busy. Before she leaves, Hetty asks Sheila to pass on a message to Gideon. Ida leaves her room and is caught out by Lady Grenford, who then gets her hair in a twist about it. Rosamond defends her actions, defying what she was ordered to do, and as she goes downstairs, she starts to get stomach cramps and is taken back to her room by Brodie. Sheila is gossiping with Gideon and Jack about Edwin being ill, which has nothing to do with his fall, which gives Jack some reassurance. But just then, it is announced by Agnes that Rosamond's baby is on the way. After a little ponder about the rash, Jack and Gideon both rush off back into the woods. Rosamond goes into labour, which is left to Hetty as Brodie goes down to check for the doctor's arrival. Back outside, Jack and Gideon are searching for a plant which Jack recalls is poisonous. They find it and they conclude that he fell on the flower, thus he is ill, and it is still their fault. Just to confirm their suspicions, they rush off to Edwin's room to have a look in one of his books. We then cut to George, who is worried about Edwin's condition. Emily is tending to her brother. He almost explains about Jack and Gideon until he suddenly falls asleep. Emily is ordered to go to the main hall to look for the doctor and to check on Rosamond, and just to make things worse, Lady Grenford comes in as well. Now back outside, where Jack is scrambling all the leaves and shows Gideon a secret route back into the house, which is hidden. Rosamond is still in labour and starts to push, but she is still concerned for Edwin. We cut back then to Jack and Gideon, who are checking Edwin's book for confirmation. The doctor has arrived and he narrows down Edwin's diagnosis, but the closest explanation is the brain fever that Emily suspected earlier. The doctor also recommends tonic, but they will see in time if he gets better. And then a very quick birth has happened. Wow, looks like the doctor has suddenly snuck in Nurse Crane and the baby has been delivered. Brodie goes off to inform George and Lady Grenford, leaving Hetty to take care of Rosamond and the baby. Gideon urges Jack to hurry up as he keeps watch for people. Brodie comes along and she hears the door shut. She goes off to investigate and finds that nobody is there. Luckily, the boys were aware of Edwin's little escape route. Now, into the escape tunnel, Jack confirms the plant that Edwin came into contact with is something called monkhood, which is really poisonous, and at this revelation, they rush off to Edwin's room. Rosamond is now burning up, and Hetty reminds her that the doctor will be with them very shortly. Upon hearing this, Rosamond's mother's instinct kicks in. Hetty places her hand over her forehead and notices that it is feverish, so she fetches help immediately. So from one patient to the next, Gideon and Jack tell Emily that they think that Edwin's been poisoned after he fell. So they are taken directly to the patient, and Emily begs Dr. Vishnu to listen to what they have to say. Oh, so it's not Dr. Turner then. Shame. Hetty searches for Brodie in the scullery and is met by unhelpful comments about well-to-do babies crying less than foundlings from Sheila. She asks Mrs. Whittock, but Agnes points out that she is with the family. Back upstairs, Lady Grenford blames Gideon and Jack over what had happened. There is an antidote, however, called belladonna, which is another very dangerous plant. Dr. Vishnu, however, keeps a few drops just in case. Dr. Vishnu then administers the medication until Hetty comes in, asking the doctor to see Rosamond. He goes to attend to her, but Lady Grenford meddles by joining him. While Hetty and Dr. Vishnu attend to Rosamond, Grenford and Brodie seem to be scheming. The new baby seems to be a barrier for Lady Grenford, who is hell-bent on claiming Calendar Hall all for herself. After a few moments, Edwin wakes up. George then commends Jack and Gideon, whose knowledge saved his son's life. Emily tells him that he has now got a younger brother who is very well. Rosamond is then given a tonic and the baby is being checked over. This makes her talk about the moment that she gave away another son of hers, Charles, years ago. This reminds Hetty of Ida, and if everybody knows about it, then the entire household may fall apart. Series 4, Episode 2. Our opening montage is of Gideon collecting a stick and finding a beetle. Sheila going into the scullery and being late yet again. Then Rosamond raiding the laundry cupboard in order to get some clothes for her baby son, William. It's worth noting here that Rosamond is a bit confused and confuses William for Charles, who is the son that she had mentioned in the last episode while she was ill. Then we have the most hypocritical sentence that I think I have ever heard from Hetty, and this is taken from the actual script. I've never gone looking for trouble. I don't have to. It finds me anyway. Example number 1. Running away to the circus. Example number 2. Running away to see Ida. Example number 3. Pretending to be Colonel Brigwell to mess with Matron Bottomley's head. And even Blanche tells her to stop. Example number 4. Focusing on the green book when it could have been handed into the police and not thinking about Harriet in the same episode. Example number 5. Starting a protest after someone got fired. Example number 7. Going into the tower every night. Example number 8. Sneaking out to watch a stunning and ecky thump brave slideshow from a stunning and brave explorer. After the title sequence, Sheila seems to have forgotten that it is baby William's christening day. So she rushes to get the bread ready and is reminded by Brodie about a cake that she really sounds unsure about when she says that it's in the pantry. Brodie lists all the food items that are needed for the afternoon, so she leaves and Sheila goes to fetch the cake, only to find that it is not there. So in walks Mrs. Whittock, who believes that the christening date is next week. Yeah, hate to burst your bubble, love. It's just a sign of getting old. You're having a senior moment. This won't have happened under Cook Jenkins, and I'll tell you that for sure. We then cut to Edwin, who is showing Gideon the beetle that he had picked up. Then, horrible grandma, Lady Grenford's demonic presence is felt as she criticises Gideon for not working and gardening abysmally, as she says, and closes all the blinds and shutters as she lectures Edwin about laziness, manipulation, and reputation. She confines him to his room and takes his wheelchair away from him. We then go to Rosamond, who is looking after William and reflects on being helpless and alone. She takes something that Hetty says the wrong way and is immediately sent out. Hetty then goes downstairs and sees a very stressed Sheila, who is then calmed slightly by Hetty looking on the bright side of life. Their conversation is caught by Lady Grenford and briefs them on the operations while sternly criticising their unprofessionalism. Hetty and Sheila head off, and George approaches Lady Grenford only to be moaned at about the former foundlings, and the idea of a housekeeper to keep them all in line is put forward. In another part of the house, Henry is tutoring Emily about Darwin and the evolution of Homo sapiens. Just then, Lady Grenford walks in and, as expected, is displeased with Emily's learning and orders her upstairs where the dressmaker is present and announces that her lessons will be supervised. As Emily walks away, she talks behind her back as if it's horrible grandma. Henry does apologise but is given the silent treatment, and Lady Grenford decides to leave. Now I have a little fact for you. The same actor who plays Henry is the same guy from Sabrina who died recently. Chance, what's his face? Basically, he was Sabrina's friend who was living in a house with, oh God, Miranda Otto and the other one. It's been a while since I watched Sabrina. Also, a side note for Sabrina, the guy who plays the main villain looks like Cranbourne as well. The one who becomes the head of the Church of Satan. Hetty goes looking for Rosamund, but finds that she has gone with baby William. Back downstairs, Brodie reassures George that the food will be ready in enough time despite the kitchen being unprepared. Emily is then overheard disliking her dress, and George goes to defuse the situation. However, that road leads to her talking about Lady Grenford's controlling behaviour, and Emily wants her thrown out. She is then told to behave for Rosamund's sake. Now we cut to Edwin's darkened room where Sheila is delivering his tea tray and is asked to open the shutters, but she's not allowed to do so. Edwin also asks her to return to the beetle to his natural habitat, but she can't do that either, so is asked to pass on a message to Gideon and Jack. We then get another short scene where Hetty is continuing to search for Rosamund. Now it's all systems go downstairs in the scullery, and to add to it all, in comes Jack and Gideon to ask for refreshments, which is of course turned down by Mrs. Whittock. And right before they leave, Sheila passes on Edwin's task, but it overrides Lady Grenford's orders. Well, she's described here as that fiend woman. Nice Bray Wyatt reference there. However, Gideon's duty to Edwin comes first, and they would both be seen as insolent either way. Back to Hetty, who is still looking for Rosamund. Lady Grenford comes across her, and George arrives as well to let her know that the vicar has arrived. Hetty lies by telling them that she needs to get some wildflowers. George then heads off as well. Lady Grenford and Brodie have a moment to themselves, and Lady Grenford promises Brodie that she shall be housemaid by the end of the day. She also doesn't trust Hetty, so she tells Brodie to keep an eye on her. Meanwhile, Gideon and Jack go into Edwin's dark room to get him to release the beetle. He insists that he does it himself because of his knowledge, but the problem is that Edwin doesn't have a wheelchair to use. So Gideon has an idea. Outside, the guests are starting to arrive, and Lady Grenford wishes to make some improvements, specifically promoting Brodie to housekeeper. George then makes the offer, and she accepts this with a smirk from Lady Grenford. Edwin is being pulled along on a go-kart by Jack and Gideon through the secret tunnel. Then we cut to Rosamund, who is found sitting on a bench in the walled garden. She feels guilty about snapping at Hetty and is worried about what everyone else is going to think of her, and doesn't want to deny the existence of Charles. Meanwhile, George is welcoming the guests and suggests to Lady Grenford that Henry is fond of Emily. She denies this, as always, and suggests a better option, and surprise, surprise, it's her grandson. Constance then runs out and says that Emily is still inside shouting at somebody. She also asks where Edwin is, and according to Lady Grenford, he is not in good sorts today, therefore he is inside. Now back to Rosamund, who is having a one-to-one with Hetty about finding her son. Hetty uses her own experience with Ida as a way to encourage her to come. He tells her that this is William's day and that she needs to be his mother. Right across the house, Edwin releases the beetle, and just for fun he wants to be wheeled around. But he is reminded of what happened last episode, and Gideon promises not to go too fast. The christening service is about to begin, and Rosamund has yet to show. Brodie goes off to fetch her when Rosamund turns up with William by her side, and the service is ready to begin. Now to more fun stuff. Edwin, Jack and Gideon are having the time of their lives until Gideon trips over in the mud. He is laughed at by Jack, and in response attempts to splash him, but it ends up going on Edwin instead. He looks disappointed for a second, but he smiles and starts a mud fight. The equivalent to the next step's food fight. Down in the scullery, Brodie comes in and announces that by the day's end, some of the servants will be packing their bags. She was also aware of the last-minute rush and she thinks that nothing is ready. Sheila humorously coughs, pointing out that all of the items are all ready and on the table. Brodie inspects this, but calls this disappointing and walks off. The picture is about to be taken and Lady Grenford arranges everybody. Just as it's about to be taken, Jack, Gideon and Edwin walk in front of the camera all muddy. So Brodie directs everybody into the conservatory and Lady Grenford dismisses Gideon and Jack, as well as telling off Edwin as well, and George, who further goes off and then dreads what will happen to his reputation. So he walks off and Lady Grenford claims that she has found a new home for Edwin. Rosamond steps in, referring to Calendar Hall as his home, and Edwin is called a blight by Lady Grenford. George realises that she was trying to shut Edwin away, so he goes on to defend his son and dismisses Lady Grenford. Edwin has a picture with Jack and Gideon so that he may remember them and the fun that they had. George comes up to inform the boys that they are not dismissed and sends them off. He then goes on to talk about taking responsibility to maintain the order of things, and actually he sounds very much like Doctor Who when he says this. He then decides to have some fun with Edwin and pulls him along in the cart. Lady Grenford is leaving and asks Brodie to keep her eye on Emily. She also suspects that Hetty knows something about Rosamond. She is also asked to gain Hetty's trust as Lady Grenford is away and will return. All of the guests are chatting away in the conservatory. Edwin is met with an awkward silence when he is pulled in. As Lady Grenford leaves, she looks at George from the other side of the room and decides to head off. The next scene consists of Brodie praising Hetty for doing well, and she becomes her friend all of a sudden. The question of should she help with things beyond control is asked, and it is presumed that it had something to do with Rosamond, as Hetty decides to back down. We end with Hetty being asked by Rosamond to help her track down Charles by talking to the one person who persuaded her to give him up. Any guesses for who that is? Gertrude Bottomley. I believe the quote, "the more things change," applies perfectly to these two episodes. So in the beginning, the foundations are laid for this new series. For instance, Rosamond being pregnant, and the new character of Mrs. Whittock, who, when I first saw her, I thought of her as this is just a discount version of Cook Jenkins, but from the South. But similar to her, she is focused on work, and she won't take any nonsense from anybody. Oh, well, that's the attitude that you should be having, Mrs. Whittock. And we also learn of the departure of Mrs. Penhaligon. I really wished that the characters would have all assembled together and went, na 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 na, na 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 na, hey, goodbye. But she is replaced by an even worse character, or two I should say, the evil Lady Grenford and Brodie. And from the moment she arrives, she decides to berate everybody, including the staff and the Calendar family. And we notice that there is something quite off about her. And also Brodie's there as well as her sidekick. As for the main story, I don't understand why Jack didn't know that the flower that Edwin had fallen on was poisonous if he had had all that knowledge in the first place. Maybe then Edwin could have been sorted out sooner rather than later. But if there is something that I can say about this episode, I like how we see Emily using her newly found medical knowledge to diagnose and to look after her brother. But however, I do agree with Lady Grenford on the fact that they should have called for a doctor for confirmation instead of self-diagnosing, because that never works, does it? I don't like the way how Hetty is too fixated on seeing Ida when she clearly has a job to do, and as if that wasn't enough stress in the episode, Rosamund gives birth at the same time, which makes the viewers think that they're going to lose both Rosamund and Edwin in the same episode. Also, this is where we have Rosamund's mother's instinct kicking in, and she starts to mention her son that she gave up years ago, Charles. If there is something I can say about this episode, it's that we are starting to see a bond form between Edwin, Jack and Gideon. I also do think that this episode brings George and Edwin closer. Speaking of George, I do think that he should have stood up to Lady Grenford earlier in the episode when she was talking spitefully about Rosamund. And speaking of which, I believe that this show has a problem with characters not informing somebody as soon as something happens. Like, Rosamund should have told everybody about... In fact, she should have told George about Charles the day that they met. And yet, is this the excuse she has for burning the Green Book that we spent a whole series talking about? And then we just have Constance, who is just there. Something else I'll say about this episode is I like how Sheila and Emily have all the comedic lines, where I think Sheila's good at doing comedy and so is Emily. I love her sarcastic remarks about Lady Grenford, especially the bit when she talks behind her back. As for episode 2, I love how this episode shows everybody how this show creates such manipulative characters, whether it be Matron Bottomley to Lady Grenford and Blanche. I do think, though, that this is a trope that happens throughout this show, where every villain is manipulative, and I think it's quite boring, personally. You know, sure, they're clever at writing and bringing everything together, and they're good at casting the villains as well, but we could have a villain that's rough and a gang leader, like a more intense version of Mr. Brunston. And what about Mr. Grace? I mean, he's not made an appearance, as I have claimed already. I believe that Mr. Grace would be a good villain to finally make an appearance and perhaps raid Calendar Hall somehow. Now, I did mention earlier that one of Hetty's opening lines is a bit hypocritical, and I believe that her problem is that she puts her foot in it far too many times and says something without thinking forward. But I will say that she's become a more thoughtful character since leaving the Foundling Hospital and uses her own experience to comfort Rosamund. Now, as I've mentioned, I've talked about how this show makes nearly every villain about the same manipulative character. But with Lady Grenford, the difference is that she has a plan. She's got a grand scheme, and there are a series of events that will unfold in order to make her vision manifest itself. But in order to make that happen, she first of all offers to marry Emily off to her grandson. Also, she locks Edwin in his room and lies about it in order to get rid of him. Kind of feel sorry for him throughout these episodes because he faces quite a lot of adversity, and adversity is part of the hero's journey. Part of the reason why I highly dislike the Transformers 1 trailer is that Optimus Prime should be given the hero's journey, and that hero's journey should consist of adversity. So in the episode War Dawn, Orion Pax and his girlfriend Ariel are both destroyed by Megatron and the Decepticons, and are both then reformed into Optimus Prime and Elita 1. In the Transformers War for Cybertron game, Optimus loses Zeta Prime, thus he is next in line to bear the name Prime. and he goes down to the core of Cybertron and embarks on this quest and eventually gets the Matrix of Leadership. Now elsewhere, I'm liking the new trio of Jack, Gideon and Edwin. I think they've all got good chemistry, and all their scenes together are pretty fun to watch. For instance, that mud fight. And I think the three of them are going to form a good friendship in the future. What I also like about the friendship between the three is that Gideon actually cares about Edwin, and he is loyal to him, and that is honourable of a man to care about his friends. Also, good on George for standing up to Lady Grenford when he heard that she had locked Edwin in his room. I also think that this is a good character change for George, because when Lady Grenford says that Edwin will be sent away, he does the right thing and stands up to her, and realises that family is more important than reputation. And I think that this episode shows that. Now, on the topic of reputation, I don't think Rosamund wants to repeat the mistakes that she had made with Charles, but as I said, she should have told everybody about Charles earlier. And maybe the situation wouldn't have been so dire. Now, I think that I've pieced together Lady Grenford's grand plan. So, first of all, she gets rid of Edwin. She also gets Emily to marry her grandson, thus he can be the next heir. Her promoting Brody means that she now has inside information if anything ever happens, and she can be kept updated. Eventually, she forces out Rosamund, and she's in control of Calendar Hall. And I believe that many more events will unfold. The episode ends with Rosamund wanting to track down her son, but in order to do that, she has to talk to Matron Bottomley about it. Can we just move on from her already? One thing that I don't like about this show is the fact that Matron Bottomley has been in it when she doesn't need to be in it. So, for instance, in the season 3 finale when she could have been arrested and it could have been over and done with. I mean, it's like going to see that one indie band who made it into the charts and then playing their one big hit. Surely we could have introduced Mr. Grace at this point, but unfortunately, that isn't the case here. I just think that the new characters that are introduced in this series are rehashes of old characters. So, for instance, Mrs. Whittock is basically another Cook Jenkins. I mean, Cook Jenkins is much more efficient than Mrs. Whittock. And that was displayed when she got the date of the christening mixed up and she had none of the ingredients. But in the end, the scullery crew made up for it when they got everything ready, apart from the meringues. Now, as for the title sequence, it's just like the old one, but they've changed it to a house instead of the Foundling Hospital. And the ending shot of when the logo comes up and we have a picture of Hetty, I think that should have been updated a bit because we're in a new setting, and I think that the title sequence should keep up with that new setting. So yeah, sorry this video took so long to come out. These will take much longer to come out now because I've got Hero Factory vs Transformers to film, and the production of these videos will be much slower in future. So thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all later. So, arigato, sayonara, matane.